when you ended up coming back for this job, this was really a homecoming for you, right?
It was always my desire to come back to Louisville. This is my home. I grew up in Jeffersonville, right across the river. My mother, who is now 91 years old, still lives there. And actually, the last time I was here, I was the head of the FBI office in Louisville, and we built a home here, my husband and I did, that we absolutely love, and so we kept it, and it was always my intent to come back.
And then left the FBI and then came back. What made you transition out of the FBI?
Well, in the FBI, we have, for special agents that is, there's actually a mandatory retirement, and the mandatory retirement age is 57 with 20 years of service. Well, I had well over 20 years of service, and I was getting to be in the mid-50 range, and I knew that it wouldn't last forever. I loved the FBI. I loved working in the FBI and doing the things that we do, and having seen all the things I saw in 29 years was just amazing. But I knew that I needed to look ahead and figure out what was next for me. And when I was the head of the office here in Louisville, they asked me to come back to headquarters, which is in Washington, D.C., for the 4th time, and I did. But after about 15 months that time, I thought, I've done this enough now. I really miss my family. I want to be back home. I want to be back in Louisville, and let's see what comes next.
And then when you came, it ended up being in the Fisher administration, correct? But what your job now is not what you started with.
That's right, yeah. They had reached out to me while I was still with the FBI and said that there was a job called the Chief of Public Services. And that job actually entailed being responsible for the fire department and emergency management, emergency services, corrections, but also public works and facilities and animal services. And I thought, well, that sounds interesting. A lot of things I've never done before, a lot of new things to learn, and it gets me back home. And I thought, sure, continuous public service. So that's what I intended to do when I came back.
And then everything changed, right? I mean, with the firings, and then you found yourself, is that when you kind of transitioned over?
Yeah, so I started in February of this year, 2020. And when I started, of course, nobody could have predicted back at the beginning of February how 2020 would unfold. And so I thought that that's what I was going to do for the rest of the administration, the rest of my time here, however long that might be. And so it wasn't until the really a discussion started to happen about whether or not there should be a public safety cabinet. And about that time, Chief Conrad had announced that he was planning to retire at the end of June. So that conversation started to build momentum, and then we had the protests. And at the end of May, that conversation got a lot stronger and a lot louder, and it was recognized, I think, by the mayor and deputy mayor, Ellen Hess, that we really needed a public safety cabinet, and so my job changed.
Any regrets with that at all for you? Because as you said, no one knew how 2020 would unfold. Let me ask the first question. Is this the toughest it's ever been on a job for you?
This has been, I've got to say, the longest sustained period of what I refer to as crisis management. So essentially, when I first started the job, like I said, I had emergency management, emergency services. Well, they were still responsible, emergency management, for the COVID response, the city's reaction and response to the COVID pandemic. And so we initially established a command post, if you will, at an emergency operations center under my authority and with the director of emergency management, who is Jody Myman. We did that actually, coincidentally, March 13th. Happened to be the same day as Breonna Taylor's shooting. But what happened was we set that up, and all of a sudden I'm in the middle of course, the crisis of responding to what had happened here in Louisville and across the country, across the world. And that rolled right into, of course, the protests at the end of May, at which point my job changed. I was given responsibility for the police department, and a few other departments were exchanged out. But I still had emergency services, emergency management, our command post, operations, corrections, and fire as well.
Are you pleased you stepped in, or has it been just one of those times? I don't know. How do you feel about it?
I hope that I hope I've been helpful. I hope in any job I've had, in any responsibility I've had, I hope that I've done some good. If I could do just a little good, if it got us a little step forward toward progress, toward a better place, that's my goal. And I really feel strongly that public service is, at least for me, the best way to do that.
Let's go to the Breonna Taylor tragedy and everything that has unfolded since. I'm not sure, certainly in my time here, which has been about 30 years, that I've seen a tougher time for this city. Would you agree with that? This has been one of the toughest times this city's ever had.
Yes, I mean, certainly I've been in and out of Louisville in the course of my FBI career, so I haven't seen everything that has happened, but of course I grew up here, and I know, and of course I've kept up with the news here, and I don't remember ever hearing or experiencing anything like this. And even in my job in the FBI, of course, we managed worldwide crises, and I would see things that would happen in other cities. And this rivals, I think, most anything that I have seen as far as what cities have gone through in different crises.
So let's talk about that. Is it because this is a turning point? This is the reckoning when it comes to police departments and trust and transparency? What is it that has made this moment so transcending versus all others?
You know, that's a great question. And I think that in looking back, of course, what we saw was the week just a few days prior to the time the protest started here in Louisville in earnest at the end of May, there was the George Floyd incident up in Minneapolis. And so what we saw there was really the catalyst for across the country. And then you saw cities react to that very strongly, even more so than we saw back when Ferguson happened or when there have been other incidents that have happened over time. And from my position back in the FBI, even though those certainly were incidents that were galvanizing, I think, in many ways in other cities, they didn't have quite the momentum. They didn't have quite the energy as
The
associated.
tipping point, really.
Correct,
Yeah.
right. It didn't seem like a tipping point like this particular period of time. And I suppose part of that is because we were in the middle of course, and still are, the global pandemic, because people's lives were disrupted, because I think tensions were high to begin with. I think because people were stressed and there was a lot of anxiety among, just in the air, I think, just in 2020. And all those things just gelled together to really, I think, create a much more exacerbating effect because of what was happening and what was seen across the country.
So let me ask you, is this the reckoning? Is this that moment where we have to reimagine how we move forward and it can no longer be business as usual?
I think it has to be, absolutely. I think that when there are certain things that happen as you look back through history that really at the time I think people were going through them, you didn't think so much, oh, this is a galvanizing moment, this is a time when everything's going to change. Until all of a sudden you're kind of in it and you're experiencing it and you realize that we're never going to go back to what we were doing before. It's not going to be like that. And that's the way currently I think about policing, is that policing is not going to be the same as it was at the end of 2019 or beginning of 2020 even. It's never going to be like that again, because now this nationwide reckoning, this intense focus on how policing works, how public safety works, how people want to be policed, how they view the responsibilities of law enforcement has changed.
Do you see, as far as the trust and transparency, that we have issues in this city that we've got to work out, obviously, moving forward?
Yeah, I think that's true across the country.
Yeah.
I think as we've seen in other cities as well, is that there is, and part of this, I think, is just because we have a much more open and transparent society. Now everything is on video, everything is exposed. There is, not a day that goes by that you are not awash with news or with social media. And to have that type of recognition, that transparency, also indicates that you get to see everything. I mean, you get to see the good, the bad, the ugly, you get to see all of it. And it has driven a lot of emotional reactions from people to say, well, I didn't know it worked that way. And why does it work that way? And should it work that way? And I think sometimes that, we tend to move a little too fast to say that, I saw something and therefore I think I understand how that works. Whereas we need to understand from multiple perspectives how certain things work. That's why I don't think you could flip a switch and it's going to change overnight.
And people need to, it will take some time, but we've already started some things. I want to go over some of the different changes that I know things have talked to. So reimagining the policing, you think it is here. We've started with new leadership already with Yvette Gentry coming in as the interim. Good move?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Yvette brings she is a force of nature and personality. She has deep, deep connections and roots in Louisville and within the community. The very communities that we are trying to reach, that public safety should be connected to, and where there is probably the most distrust. And I think that having her come on board at this time is a great thing for the city.
She seems to be able to straddle both worlds with protesters, with police, and have the respect of both, which is tough to do.
Yeah, and you know, to your point is that I really do worry sometimes that the conversation becomes too binary. It becomes a one side versus another side. It becomes very opposing factions.
Well, that was a question that I had, because it seems like you have to be I have felt that way in this conversation too. I've joined some of the protests, but I've had police officers in my family. And it's like, I don't think it has to be one or the other, although often it feels like that.
Yes, I would agree. Is that, and what I worry about is that when people feel like they have to pick a side, then we're not in a good space to have productive conversations. We're not in a good place to try to reach consensus or agreement on things. And so if you feel like you have to be on one side or the other, it actually further divides us. And we're not able to really think through what are the best solutions for everyone as opposed to just one side or the other.
So that's one of the starting places that you and I would agree on that. Let's talk about a new chief. Hopefully by the end of the year, you've narrowed it down to what, about 13, 14-ish?
Right, we were actually very fortunate to have as many applicants. I honestly was kind of afraid of what we were going to get. I didn't know how many people might be interested in a job right now.
Just because we're such a hot spot?
Yes, because, well, and policing in general is
Yeah.
actually, if you read across the nation right now, police chief jobs are very, very competitive right now. There are a lot of chief openings, and the reason that there are so many openings is, of course, the city's experiencing what we've experienced, but also there's not a lot of people who are willing to take on these challenges right now, and who are looking to this to say that, look, I recognize that if I take this job, it's a great risk to,
Right.
my reputation, my credibility, and my longevity in the job, and my career prospects after that. And so to find that many people, we had over 25 people apply for this particular position, which I was thrilled about. These are sitting chiefs and high executives in other organizations and other law enforcement agencies.
So hopefully by the end of the year, they will be named. My concern on this, it's only for about 2 years under the current mayor. Does that make it a tougher job to sell? I mean, 2 years to give up where they are now to come here, that's a tough sell.
A little bit, yeah. Absolutely. I think that is one of the concerns that candidates have, is that because they look at this and they say, your mayor only has 2 years in January, so that'd be January 2023 then, in order for me to do all of these things that I want to come in and do. Now, granted, of course, a new mayor can always come in and change out, their political appointees, but at the same time, even though it's rare, some administrations choose to keep the prior chief if they're doing a good job, if they feel that they are actually moving the city forward. And so that's one thing. The other thing is that our budget cycle, of course, works on the June 30th, July 1st. So it is possible we could keep that person through the budget cycle. So that's really more like 2.5 years. And so stretching it into that, and then also the opportunity, I think, for somebody to come in here and do as much as they can in those 2.5 years. I think is exciting. It's challenging.
Make a mark.
Yes.
Now, and I'm assuming the group who's done this, they're looking at who can reimagine. I think this city, from what I gather, just by what I've seen, what I've read, they're not looking at, as we said, business as usual. We're looking for a game changer. Would you agree with that assessment?
I would. And as part of this police chief search, I mean, we started this immediately, actually it was even before Chief Conrad was fired on June 1st, because he had announced his retirement. So we knew at that point we needed to start looking for a new police chief. And so we contracted with the Police Executive Research Forum, PERF, who has done hundreds of these searches over time in many, many cities, and has a great network to pull from. And what we did is we first started with community input. And what I mean by that is we started with public surveys. We started with a survey just for the LMPD, and we started with listening sessions where we had over 21 listening sessions with different community groups. Everybody from faith leaders to elected officials to activists to LMPD itself to the FOP. And so we pulled all that input together, over 10,000 survey responses, and all of them said that they are looking for the next chief. That person needs to be accountable, transparent, inspirational. That person needs to be reform-minded and really engage the community. Get the trust of the community and rebuild that trust.
You hope that they're in that pile. You can see that person in that pile that you all are looking at?
I do. I'm optimistic because I feel like, in seeing the candidates that we have and the panel that has been convened going through these applications, I think it's very clear that some of these candidates we have are very, very well respected. They have some amazing bona fides, and I think that they exude so far, even though we're just starting the interview process, they exude the enthusiasm, that they're up to the challenge.
Let's talk about the top to bottom review. We've got all sorts of things. I'm not going to go name everything, but through that settlement with Breonna Taylor's family, no-knock warrants are now out, new leadership, the top to bottom review, independent civilian review, all of those different changes to, I guess, make the police department more accountable. You see those happening, you see those as being effective.
I do. Yes, to answer your question, absolutely. Police reform is such a hot topic, of course, now. And what I worry about a little bit is that many cities, many places, jurisdictions across the country tend to get the flashy object syndrome where every idea is worth pursuing. And so we start to go down one path and then we switch to another path and switch to another path, and we don't stop to think about what the residual impacts are or how it might effectively help or hurt public safety and policing and the community itself there as a result. And so I think we need to be focused and prioritize what we really want to see in our police department, what we really want to see in law enforcement. And a lot of cities, we are not the first one to do this and the only ones doing this. And so a lot of cities are going down the same path, and we can learn from each other. And that's what I think is exciting about not only the top-down review of the department, but also all the different police reform efforts.
Let me ask you, one thing that I know disheartened a lot of people when we saw some of those emails come out from commanders where they were disparaging the protesters, and it really pointed to somewhat of a culture issue in the police department. A, would you agree that there has been a culture issue, and how do you change that?
Well, I think part of the problem is that, again, 2020 has been an experience like no other. I think there's a lot of, like I said, tension, a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress all the way around. And I'm not condoning that these messages that went out. I'm just saying that perhaps in other times, maybe that wouldn't have happened. That frustration wouldn't have bubbled up to the point that it did. But at the same time, it does indicate that we do need to do a lot of introspection. All of us, each one of us, needs to look within ourselves to determine and decide, how am I viewing this situation and how should I view this situation? And one of the things the top-down review is going to do for us is to identify where in policies or training are things built into the system we didn't even realize were there that tends to drive a culture that is problematic. And so where are those things? And I'm not saying that, every person's different. The way they react to training, the way they react to policies is maybe different. But where can we improve those things that would help us get to a better place?
And some of the different things that I saw in there, the independent investigations of officer-involved shooting, transparency in investigations, strengthening civilian oversight, Inspector General. What does that mean exactly, an Inspector General?
Yeah, so some of the things that we saw in other cities, and one of the things that certainly this administration and Metro Council and others in the community are very, very interested in is, does it make sense for a police department to investigate itself or exclusively investigate itself? I don't think there will be a time where we can totally exclude the police department from investigating itself, because I think it's necessary. I think it's necessary to have some type of internal investigation component within any organization. But at the same time, there should be checks and balances on that work. And when it reaches a certain level, I think that there should be perhaps a more objective review. A more objective review meaning an outside entity or some external entity that doesn't have ties within the same organization it's investigating. We did this in the FBI, and we would have an internal investigation component, but at the same time we also had external entities, and we were bound to report to external review oversight committees and the like. And I think that's an important check and balance to have.
When you see some of this coming out with the PIU, and I'm sure you can't talk about a lot of it, but it's certainly, just as a layperson and reading some of this, it seems like, I mean, you hear words like, that was egregious from within the department and different things like that. I'm assuming cause for concern. At the very least, it looked like mistakes were made on some levels, even with people who were involved in the shooting going back into what turned into I guess a crime scene is the correct word, and those kinds of things, which are troubling when you read these things.
Well, and I can't talk about the ongoing investigation, but there's currently a professional standards investigation that will look at exactly those things. Is that even though perhaps there wasn't enough to present for a criminal prosecution in certain instances, that doesn't mean that there weren't policy violations, that there weren't some other types of violations of practices or procedures that we should be looking at, that should have potentially repercussions, that should have some type of discipline associated with it.
But you understand then why the public, when they sees these things, I mean, it's like, see, I mean, so you understand why some of those feelings exist.
Sure, and I think that drives back to the conversation of trust. And I think that for an entity to investigate itself is always going to be problematic, no matter how objective that entity tries to be. I think it's always important to say, well, let other people see the data, see the facts. And I think that's part of why you saw that release of information last week from the administration, was to put that out there so that people could see exactly what you're describing. And to, whether it reflects, poorly or well on any particular individual, I think is irrelevant to the primary focus, which is to get the information out there so that people can,
People can
assess
decide.
themselves.
Let's go back to that either or, because with people who remain in the police department, my guess is it can't be easy to be in that department right now. How do you rebuild from the inside as well when you have a mass exodus, you have a public who's not trusting? I mean, and how do you keep the best officers, recruit better officers, and the top of the heap? I don't know the answer to that.
And I can tell you that is one of the things that keeps me up at night right now, because what I worry about is policing across the country is not exactly a desirable occupation at the moment. And so if we talk about, or we even mandate in certain ordinances or legislation that a police department has to reflect the communities that it's serving, well, the problem is that means you have to recruit. People will have to want the job. How do you get them to want to be a police officer right now, particularly in the communities where there's the most distrust? And so that is, to me, a huge challenge at the moment. So we need to rethink, how do we recruit? How do we make this an attractive option? Because otherwise, what incentive are we giving those individuals to want to take this on, to want to be a police officer in this day? And so what we see across departments, altogether across the country right now is impacts to morale, people leaving, family members who are telling the police officer that, I don't want you going through this. I don't want you to be doxxed on social media. I don't want you to have, threats against you, and I don't want you to go through this right now. So I think you should quit. And so that's why we're seeing a record number, I think, of, like you said, a mass exodus. And even the ones who stay, I think, are concerned about, what do I do as far as proactive policing? How will that reflect on me? If I do anything to initiate activity, how will that reflect on me? It could be, I'm one small step for making a wrong move that's going to essentially ruin my reputation, my career. And so right now, how do we get past that? Because we can't just be a reactionary force when it comes to public safety. In order to build trust with the community, you've got to engage. You've got to proactively engage with the community.
So again, I guess this comes with reimagining. What's the next step? What's it going to look like? And it's strange when you're in the middle of it, right? Like you're saying that we're going to kind of have to figure this out step by step of where we go from here.
Yeah, yes, exactly. And I think that this is where we need to have those longer conversations. And what I worry about, again, is that if everybody retreats to their corner, then we're not having productive conversations. We're not getting to that better place. And, for example, police reform issues. So one thing to keep in mind is that they sound great to many people, but if the police don't feel like they were part of the solution to be able to arrive at those things, to be able to inform those things, then how much buy-in do you get? They will do it because it's policy, but will they really feel it? Will they really want to do it? And so that's the culture change we're talking about. The police have to be part of the solution. They have to be sitting at the table, and the community has to be at the table.
And one thing that you all had talked about as well are social workers, because I really do believe police officers are put in situations, whether it deals with addiction, mental health issues, all of that. Do you think that's a good move with the social workers?
Absolutely, I do. I think that there are so many circumstances that I've seen in my 29 plus years now in public safety where there's no reason that a police officer should have been at that place, at that location with that individual, other than the fact that people don't know who else to call and there's no other option. And so a police officer who arrives at a certain situation to deal with someone who's experiencing a mental health crisis, or maybe an addiction problem, or some other type of personal crisis, maybe the police officer is not the best equipped or really the best trained person to deal with that situation. And so we've seen in other cities, Portland, Denver, Houston, they have these models that we're looking at right now. How do social workers, how do mental health professionals factor into the equation?
I guess these past few months, what do you think, I guess, has been the biggest lesson that you've learned through all of this?
I would say that, and I always kind of knew this from my experience in the FBI, but that I never make a decision based on just getting one side of the story. Is you've got to get everyone's perspective. So, for example, on a daily basis, I hear all the time from, one of my departments, one of the, agencies that falls under my cabinet, and I've got to remember there's always another side to the story. By the same token, I also, hear a lot of things from the community, a lot of accusations about the police department, and I need to, recognize that we've got to get both sides. We've got to understand that, and that has really in this year. It's driven that point home to me even more so, is that we are not going to accomplish anything if we only get one side of the story, if we're not willing to sit at the table, if we're not willing to have a dialogue and be able to reach across to be able to connect with the other side.
What have you learned about yourself, do you think? I heard you on the one thing saying, look, mistakes have been made. I've made some of those mistakes. What have you learned about yourself in this whole process in the past few months?
Yeah, what struck me, Rachel, is that I certainly and have always admitted that I'm fallible, that I make mistakes. Why is that so hard for people to admit? Why is that so hard for other people to say that? Because I think the sooner that we can own something and take responsibility for something, to say that, yes, I made mistakes, absolutely. Other people did too. And I think the sooner we can own those and take responsibility for those and take responsibility for our own actions and what got us here, I think the sooner we're on a path to recovery, the sooner we're on a path to healing, and the sooner we can get to perhaps productive solutions and ideas.
That middle ground, that humanity that, we've all made mistakes. Now, where do we find that middle ground, that this conversation to begin?
Yes, exactly.
And my last question to you, where do you see hope in all of this? Because I think we've all agreed that, the city's been boarded up. Those boards are now coming down, which is a great symbolic gesture, but are people going to feel safe to come back downtown, to re-engage with one another as community. And the board's coming down in all parts of our community where there's, been racial disparity for sure and still is. I guess my signs of where you see hope in moving forward.
I would say that, and of course I tend to be optimistic to begin with, but I see the city returning to the way it was before? No. I don't see police returning to the way they were before. I don't see the community returning to the way it was before. And that's not just because of the protests and the quest for social justice. That's also because of the pandemic. Because just the way we do business, think about that. The way we do business in 2020 has changed forever the way we did business before. And so I think that just our interactions, all those things will change. But I am hopeful because what I see is as we move forward, we're trying to find little pieces where we can agree, little pieces where we actually have common ground and we can find common ground. We're not just yelling at each other and we're not just, not willing to listen. I see every day or every few days, I see just a little bit of progress toward that objective. And that's what gives me hope, because I do think that we will get to a place where it may not look the same as it did in 2019, but I think we'll be in a different and a better place if we keep down this path.
And 2 years with Ms. Mayor, because you're an appointee, what's next for you if it's not within city government?
I feel, at least for me, is that if I can do a little good while I'm here, then that's my goal. And whatever comes next for me, I just hope that it gives me some sense of being able to give back to the community I love, to Louisville, to the people here. And if I can do that in some other capacity and some other job, great. I'm all for it. But the other thing I need to focus on too is my family, and I want to spend time with them as well. And the whole reason I came back was to spend time with them and with the city I love.